Okay, good evening, everyone. Hope you're doing good. Uh, Thank you for joining us today. We're here in this lecture today to discuss museums and modern Assyrians, what belongs to whom. Um, this is a topic that's very interesting. I've been asked a lot of questions about it from a legal perspective, cultural perspective, political perspective. And so before we begin, I'd like to pose a couple of questions to my trusty assistants, Sarah and Pierre. And these questions I'm going to return to again at the end of the lecture. So, Sarah, you're the director of what used to be the Oriental Institute, what is now the Institute of Study of Ancient Cultures in the year 2030. So you've left the Ashurbanipal Library, you're working there. A group of Assyrian organizations in Chicago or Chicagoland has gathered and is requesting that the artifacts contained in the Assyrian Empire Gallery of the museum be given over to Assyrian organizations. They've built a place in Lincolnwood. They've got plenty of space, 80,000 square feet. They can keep these artifacts there. They're all 501c3s, meaning they're tax exempt organizations. And they're arguing that since they do not have a country, they've been enduring persecution. And there's a repatriation movement going on in the world. Recently, President Macron made a statement about returning artifacts to their country, specifically to Africa, but other countries. Um, so there is this going on. They argue that they're entitled to these artifacts. If you are arguing against them, what would you say?
Okay, thank you. Let me just get in character. Um, so first, as director, I would respect the passion and the commitment the Syrian community has, for its heritage. And it's clear how deeply the Syrian people care about these artifacts, and that's something that, as the director of the ISAC, it's something we value. But that said, I think there are important reasons why the artifacts in the Assyrian Empire Gallery can't simply be moved. At ISAC, they are a part of a broader system of preservation and scholarship that kind of already just ensures the widest possible accessibility. The artifacts are integrated into, archives and research databases and records, which easily allows scholars, students, and community members worldwide to kind of discover and study them. So I think moving them outside of this system could risk reducing their visibility and limit the tools we have to connect them to global audiences. Um, and the ISAC's mission is not only to care for the physical objects, but again, as I mentioned, to make them discoverable, to digitize them, to catalog them accurately and appropriately, and then connect them to other Assyrian and Near Eastern collections across academic institutions to, again, promote new scholarship and research. This level of accessibility and preservation is only possible within the infrastructure and I think the networks that ISAC has built over the past century. But you did touch on conversations happening about repatriation. Those conversations are important, but I feel like they're typically framed around returning objects to sovereign nations, and it would kind of prove challenging to file a legal claim about that. And the university museums have a responsibility to honor certain agreements made with countries of origin, which are kind of detailed already in the acquisitions policy. But this is not to say that like we don't support the Syrian community here and abroad. And I think it'd be best to provide Assyrians with a meaningful way to access the collections. That's why I see partnership as the best way forward. The museum maybe would like to collaborate with the Assyrian community in certain exhibitions. Um, physical and digital, host joint programs that makes the artifacts more, accessible not just to Chicago's Assyrian community, but to anyone who just wants to learn more about Assyrian heritage. Um, but I do believe, and I'll stand on that, it is in everybody's best interest that the artifacts remain at the ISAC. However, I think it would also work very well to engage with the Assyrian community to kind of develop more ways for people to discover and access and engage with the objects through the gallery online, or collaborative projects that kind of bring the history closer to everyone.
Okay, so if I get your point is you're not really challenging the legality of the Assyrian claim. You're challenging that whether they would be able to keep better the artifacts that the museum has, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, Pierre, you are the attorney hired by these Assyrian organizations. Go ahead and argue against Sarah's viewpoint and reclaim those artifacts.
Uh, yeah, I got to get myself in character as well for this one. I think the first thing that's important when discussing this and thinking about it is, what are museums? What is their purpose? Sarah, you brought this about, really working together with communities to preserve and, having joint projects and everything. I mean, I think that's the spirit of where the Assyrian community and, my community here is coming from in this case. We just want to be able to possess what is historically ours, what the museum tells us is also ours. And, that's something that the museum can help work with us to help preserve these things. And I mean, we clearly have a facility that's able to house them here in Lincolnwood that's 80,000 square feet. We're prepared for this. This is something that we've looked forward to. So it's not a matter of, can we, and that's what you started this discussion with, can we do it? Or, would it be fair to do that? Especially because we've spent so much work doing it with all these documents. I mean, things in museums change hands all the time. It's actually really been a modern policy of museums to really start and to try and correct the policies of the past. Robert brought up Emmanuel Macron, and what's been changing in museums across the world. I mean, just because the Assyrians don't have a state doesn't mean that we can't be stewards of our own cultural heritage. I mean, that's really what we've been called to do, is preserve our own cultural heritage. And I mean, we'd love to work with the Oriental Museum. It's not called the Oriental Museum anymore, but we'd love to work with them in terms of helping us do justice in preserving these things, but in our hands where it belongs. I mean, especially when you can say the contributions Assyrians made to even discovering these things, including the excavations at Nineveh, with people like Hurmes Rossam. I mean, in all the studies of archaeology these days, it's important to look at what efforts Native people played in discovering these artifacts. And I really think that's something that's been overlooked, and we really need to go to the table and discuss this. But at the end of the day, it's as simple as Assyrians should be stewards of their own heritage, especially when we are able to house them in this moment, in this hypothetical scenario. We're able to house them, we're able to take care of it, we're able to prepare for it, and we're willing to work with museums and scholars to make this a public thing. It's not something that we just want to solely possess it for ourselves. It's about the stewardship of it. It's about, where does ownership come from in this end? We still want to share the knowledge with everyone else. The same goal applies as for a museum. It's just a matter of correcting the wrongs of the past when these were unfortunately taken from us in some cases. But we've proven ourselves responsible at this moment to be able to take care of such a thing.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Pierre. Congratulations on the building that you guys got. That's very impressive. 80,000 square feet. Wow. I hope you will keep the Ashurbanipal Library there.
Oh, we're planning on it. Don't worry. We're planning on
Excellent.
expanding the library.
Okay. All right. So the whole point of this discussion is to think in terms of who really owns these artifacts. Who do they belong to? To whom do they belong? And to think in terms of when Pierre said this belongs to us, like who's the us? Now, I want you to think, Pierre and Sarah, also about this. Say you're in the middle of the lawsuit, you've sued the Oriental Institute or ISAC, And there's an intervening party, and that is the country of Iraq or the state of Iraq. They come in and they say, wait a minute, do not give these artifacts to these Assyrian organizations. We should have the first option. It should be us to whom these things belong. So let me go through the lecture, and then we're going to come back to this question. So I'm going to come back to you, Sarah, and to you, Pierre, just to give me kind of your reaction once you hear everything here. Now, I want to ask the question, what's the legal standing of the Assyrians? Because this has been brought up many times. Why can't we sue for these artifacts? What's the legal standing of the Assyrians or Assyrian organizations or organizations that represent Assyrians? What's the cultural link between modern Assyrians and ancient Assyrians? How should Assyrians view their relationship with these artifacts? How do non-Assyrians view the relations? And what should we do in the future? And here's a picture of my lovely friend, Rabi who's in Chicago. A lot of Assyrians go to these places and to these museums, and they have a very interesting relationship with these artifacts. And I'm going to say something about that in the following slides. So I want to tell you that there are two views in terms of looking at many of these artifacts. There is, of course, the view that academics have, and there is, for example, in a particular article, whom does heritage belong to? The case of St. John, John's cave in Romania. And the author in this case looks at Radu Alexandru Dragoman, looks at this particular cave in Romania, and he's sort of critical of the way academics look at it. And he's critical of the Romanian government's view, which is influenced by, excuse me, a kind of a secular academic and scholarly view at this religious shrine or cave of St. John. And he contrasts this with the Orthodox view or the Christian view, which sees these places as living spiritual sites. They are not simply places that are touristic or simply academic of academic interest, but rather have an interesting relevance to people from a religious perspective. In essence, this paper that is written, that is interesting to the Assyrians as well, of course, in this example, calls for recognizing the legitimacy of religious communities. So one could place Assyrian communities in here and say, for example, the Assyrians have a special relationship with their relics. Religious communities in interpreting and caring for their own sacred heritage, rather than leaving control solely to either academic institutions or states. Now, this is a view, and in this case, there was some cooperation between the Romanian government and the Orthodox Church, and that largely was because of the influence of the Orthodox Church that was still strong or is strong in Romania. There's an interesting case that helps us to kind of see in terms of how we should understand cultural heritage, especially when it comes to museum pieces, and that is the Hobby Lobby case. Many of you have no doubt heard of this case, and I've been called a number of times by a number of people asking me whether Assyrians have any standing to become involved in a case like this. Now, this case is the United States of America versus approximately, that's the name of the case, approximately 450 cuneiform tablets and 3,000 clay bullae. This was a case in the District Court of New York, and the parties were the United States government, and the defendant party were the ancient artifacts illegally imported from Iraq by Hobby Lobby. And the the story is that between 2010 and 2011, Hobby Lobby, a large US arts and crafts retailer, purchased thousands of ancient artifacts, cuneiform tablets, cylinder seals, bullae from dealers in the United Arab Emirates and mostly from Israel. The artifacts originated from Iraq or ancient Mesopotamia and were intended for the company's planned Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., which you see pictured here. The company paid about $2 million, $1.6 million for the artifacts and imported them into the United States through shipments falsely labeled as ceramic tiles or samples from Turkey or Israel. And so they were concealing their origin. Now, what were the legal issues here? Well, we bought these items. They were sold to us and we bought them. We didn't steal them from anyone. There was the violation of the Cultural Property Implementation Act, CPIA. This is a US law. It enforces US obligations under international conventions protecting cultural property. Imported items were cultural property illegally removed from Iraq through various people who dug up these items. We don't know exactly how they were dug up, which has strict laws prohibiting the export of antiquities. Now, despite this case, of course, this keeps going on, and there are many such artifacts that are found in Chicago and New York and other cities across the Western world where a lot of these items are sold. And there's a whole discussion about whether buying them encourages more of these items to be dug up and these sites to be looted and these items to be brought to the West. There were false customs declarations. Shipments were mislabeled and undervalued, of course, which is a violation of US law. And there was illicit trafficking in cultural heritage. Now, Hobby Lobby claimed lack of knowledge in terms of where exactly they came from and what was being violated. Despite this, it proceeded with a purchase. Now, the Convention on Cultural Property Implementation, it restricts importation of designated archaeological or ethnological material into the United States unless proper documentation is provided, and it has to be from the country, not from any particular institution, but the country. And the exportation has to be lawful. The law applies to artifacts from Iraq. Now, remember, this is since 1990, not before. So many of the items, for example, that we discussed in the what used to be the Oriental Institute or the Institute of Culture, Study of Ancient Cultures in the Chicago area, those were imported much earlier than 1990. And this is the law. And the outcome of the case was that Hobby Lobby bought over 5,500 artifacts, all these pieces, cylinder seals, etc., for about 1.6 million from these dealers. The dealers were not prosecuted. Many artifacts were shipped under false labeling. As we said, an expert had warned them that items came from Iraq or other conflict zones that and that orange red flags indicated potential looting, but Hobby Lobby went ahead anyway, so they were forewarned. In 2017, the company agreed to forfeit the artifacts to the US government and paid $3 million fine and adopted a strict acquisition policies going into the future. In 2018, about 3,800 of those artifacts were returned to Iraq. There's no news as to the rest of these artifacts, what happened. In other words, another 1,700 we're not certain of. What Iraq did not get, no part of the fine was paid to Iraq. And as far as the public records show, directed to anywhere to Iraq, the fine was paid to the US government. The items are tangible items, and financial penalty was a separate issue. That's simply a ticket that Hobby Lobby paid. And the prosecuting attorney in this case, Richard Donahue, made a statement. The Republic of Iraq, standing on the land that was once the home to the storied city-states and kingdoms of Mesopotamia, has celebrated heritage as a cradle of civilization. We are proud to have played a role in removing these pieces of Iraq's history from the black market of illegally obtained antiquities and restoring them to the Iraqi people. So to whom do these artifacts belong? One country to another country. So the United States to the people of Iraq, or the Iraqi people, meaning it has to be a country that is in charge of these artifacts. Do Assyrians have any say in the Hobby Lobby case? Assyrian organizations, for example, let's say representing Assyrian people, face significant legal challenges in owning artifacts of ancient Assyrians due to various statutes and international agreements governing cultural property. So the short answer is no, they have no legal standing. Ownership disputes over such artifacts often involve claims by source countries like Iraq, as well as the museums in Western countries. So museums in Western countries have legitimate, according to legal doctrine, legitimate say in such items, either in terms of owning them outright or leasing them long-term. And as we'll see in the case of Rubin versus the Islamic Republic of Iran, there was a long-term lease, which is still ongoing by the University of Chicago. Well, all right, so Assyrians have no say in terms of their ownership or link to a lot of these ancient artifacts. Well, what about, for example, Jewish communities? In 2010, Iraq accused Israel of stealing manuscripts. The Iraqi tourism industry accused the Israeli Mossad of involvement in the theft of ancient Iraqi manuscripts that happened to be Jewish, that were transported out of Iraq and sold in Israel. The manuscripts were part of a Jewish archive that belonged to the state of Iraq. They were stolen by thieves and ended up in Israel, Iraqi sources reported. The ministry, Iraqi ministry, said that Israel did not respond to a request from Iraq to return these historical inheritance through the United Nations. Now, Iraq takes the position that whether these artifacts are Christian or Islamic or Assyrian or etc., they belong to Iraq. The United States said that the manuscripts were sent to Washington from Iraq for restoration, but never returned to Iraq. And Iraq published a list of thousands of ancient artifacts and manuscripts that were stolen from Iraqi museums after the US forces captured Baghdad in 2003. Now, although this saddens many Assyrians, they have absolutely no status and no say in how these artifacts are distributed and how they are taken up. One Jewish magazine in the United States in this year asked, who is the rightful owner of a stunning collection of Iraqi Judaica known as the Iraqi Jewish Archives, the descendants of the country's exiled Jewish community now living in the United States, or the Iraqi government that stole the material from its Jewish population in the first place? Now, of course, this is a claim that's being made. It's not exactly the position of Iraq. Iraq's position is that these items come from Iraq. They were part of Iraqi history, and so they belong to Iraq. And so the Jewish community has a long history in Iraq, of course, and there are two views toward this position, toward this case, I should say, toward this issue, which have not been solved. One issue, Gina Waldman, who's the executive director of Jews Indigenous to the Middle East and Africa in San Francisco, stated that the archives were looted by the Iraqi government from the Jewish community. We hope the US government will bar the return of the archives to Iraq and do everything possible to reach a mutually agreeable, fair and just agreement so that the Iraqis are encouraged to hand the archives to the rightful Jewish owners. So one position is that they belong to the community, which is now in the United States. Another position by Charles Goldstein, which disagreed. He's counsel to the Commission for Art Recovery. And he states that this is not a legal issue. It's not normally a violation of international law when a country, remember, a country, a state, takes property from its citizens. That may be different if you can prove discriminatory taking without compensation, which may be the case here, but each individual owner of the item would have to make a claim. A claim cannot be made by the Jewish community abroad. So there are two views towards this issue. One is that states are really in charge of these items, in other words, large entities, institutions. And another is, well, that the community should have them. And this issue has not been resolved. Well, there's an interesting case also dealing with artifacts, this time of Iranian artifacts from Persepolis, which are now at the Institute of Ancient, or Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. This is the case of Rubin versus the Islamic Republic of Iran, which went to the Supreme Court of the United States. Several American victims of 1997 suicide bombing in Jerusalem brought a lawsuit against the government of Iran. They recovered a certain amount. And so these plaintiffs were looking for a way to get to the assets of the Iranian government. And they found a number of assets in the United States. And these were collections of Iranian antiquities, including artifacts from Persepolis, which are at the Oriental Institute or Institute of Study of Ancient Cultures, as well as the Field Museum in Chicago and a couple of other places. Iran, along with the museums, opposed the seizure, maintaining that the objects were culturally significant. These are not items that you should have. Again, the state should be the one to say where these items go, and protected by sovereign immunity. The dispute centered on whether these artifacts loaned to U.S. institutions for research and loaned to the University of Chicago, for example, and not used for commercial purposes could legally be seized to satisfy the victim's judgment. And the U.S. basically sided with the government of Iran in this case and said the property at issue here consists of ancient Persian artifacts documenting a unique aspect of Iran's cultural heritage. So to that country belongs this cultural heritage that were lent to a U.S. institution in the 1930s for academic study. Execution against such unique cultural artifacts could cause affront and reciprocity problems. So there's a bit of not so much legal, but a utility issue here. You know, if we are to go ahead and do this, it may be possible, but if we are to go ahead and do this, it's going to cause us major problems. In the end, the plaintiffs lost and they were not able to recover. Now, what does all this have to do with Assyrians? Well, it helps to have some kind of background as to the legal issues and the cultural issues. Well, what about the Assyrian connections? There is cultural and symbolic connection, of course, as you saw in the images. And as you'll see, Assyrians like to go near these artifacts that are kept in these museums, as well as in the open air in Iraq, for example. But since the Assyrian population is largely residing in the West, in cities such as Chicago, New York, Paris, London, Moscow, and other places, you can find a lot of these Assyrian artifacts that are dispersed just as the Assyrian people are dispersed. So there is a cultural and symbolic connection to them that Assyrians have. There's a historical disposition and colonial legacy that one has one sympathizing with the Assyrians. There is the issue of legal and institutional entitlement. So really the entitlement goes against the Assyrians. There's moral and cultural entitlement that one needs to think about. And there's contemporary movements and possibilities. Now, Sarah brought up a couple of issues, and we are going to go into them. And Pierre also brought up an issue, and he did say, if I'm correct in this, Pierre, that Assyrians helped dig up these items, and that's true. Layard did say that, quote, in his book, Nineveh and Its Remains, the Arabs were selected to remove the earth. They were unable to dig. This part of the labor required stronger and more active men, and I chose for it about 50 Nestorian Chaldeans That's the way Assyrians are referred to in the Hakkari Mountains, who had sought work for the winter in Mosul, and many of whom, having already been employed, had acquired some experience in excavating. So a lot of these Assyrians had experience in excavating a lot of these ruins. And you see in this photograph, which is in Dur Sharukin, the city of Sargon, that the Assyrians are standing here in conical caps. Most of them in the front of the photograph are Assyrians who had dug up many of these. So these items were removed not because there was permission given or there was some kind of a treaty. They were removed by European or Western archaeologists, and sometimes it's a stretch to call them archaeologists, but at any rate, they were removed. And this took place really with minimal consultation and was exploitative as far as the country was concerned, whatever authority existed in that country. So the Assyrians were marginalized subjects of the Ottoman Empire in this particular case and had really nothing to say. This puts the Assyrians within a broader kind of framework of dispossession akin to other indigenous peoples. And so the Assyrians, although we have their sympathy, they have our sympathy. They had nothing to do with the digging of these items, nor did they have a say in the destruction of many of these items. So the argument is often made that if these items were not taken and protected in the West, they would have become victims just as they did in 2014 and between 2014 and 2017, when ISIS entered, destroyed, looted, and trafficked countless Assyrian artifacts from Nineveh and its surrounding sites. And these were, of course, this was a great tragedy, and Assyrians really suffered a lot from seeing these images, the destruction of not only their communities, the living community, and the destruction of their churches, and the vandalizing of many of their homes and villages and emptying of their villages, but also the destruction of their very ancient artifacts, along with, of course, many of the manuscripts. But it must be pointed out, as we've stressed, there is no legal standing for modern Assyrians or their organizations, as they are a stateless people. As Sarah pointed out earlier, there's no sovereignty here for the Assyrians. They do not currently possess international standing to claim ownership or repatriation rights under conventions like, for example, the 1970 UNESCO Convention or the United Nations Idroit Convention of 1995, which primarily operates through states. Again, Iraq is a modern successor state to the ancient Assyrian territory. And of course, this is also with Syria. And Turkey, with a lot of Assyrian ruins, is the legal claimant here. This legal structure excludes the Assyrian people from decision-making about artifacts that represent their own cultural origins. So there is an argument to be made, but at this time, there is no legal standing in any court. But the moral view, from a moral anthropological perspective, Assyrians have legitimate claim of cultural affiliation. The concept of cultural patrimony recognizes that Assyrian identity-based communities, even without sovereignty, can have enduring connections. The Assyrians can continue to have a connection to their ancient past. And museums and heritage institutions are increasingly recognizing. You saw how kind the director of the Oriental Institute or ISAC was in dealing with Assyrians. And that is very true at this time. The Assyrians do have a good relationship with many of these institutions, whereas that was not the case before. The Assyrians received kind of a cold shoulder years ago. That's not the case now. The case is that Assyrians do have good relationships. And Assyrians have a role. There's a growing push for shared custodianship of a lot of these items, collaborations between the Assyrians and local scholars and diasporic communities, Assyrian communities. And of course, now we have something that we didn't have before, and that is digital access. Virtual repatriation is an issue, 3D imaging, bilingual labeling, and so on. Assyrian-led cultural foundation can help reclaim narrative control. Here you see a picture of the Ashurbanipal Library as it is, which is coming close to celebrating its 40th anniversary. As Assyrians build archives, libraries, and cultural institutions in the diaspora, such as the Ashurbanipal Library, these become platforms for symbolic restitution and continuity of historical consciousness. So rather than fighting in the courts, Assyrians can also begin to have a role in rebuilding their heritage and watching over their items in cooperation with other institutions, but also in terms of having their own institutions. You could tell from this picture that there are many trips made to the Institute in Chicago, where about 100,000 Assyrians live. Modern Assyrians trace their identity, language, and heritage to these artifacts and have a special sort of feeling when they encounter these artifacts. They're not merely archaeological curiosities, but symbols of historical memory and identity. And many times I've seen many Assyrians who observe these artifacts show a great deal of either pride or sadness. It evokes emotions on the part of many Assyrians. So for today's Assyrians, they provide a tangible evidence of an indigenous civilization whose legacy persists through language, tradition, and collective memory, especially vital for a people dispersed by persecution and statelessness. So in sum, legally, modern Assyrians do not have any formal entitlement or standing, it is called in court. There's no jurisdiction that can be had, as well as organized financial backing to do anything in terms of their artifacts. Morally and culturally, they have strong and growing claims as living descendants of the civilization whose artifacts populate the world's museums, and they can write and they can duplicate and they can advocate and they can interact with these institutions. And practically, the way forward lies in Assyrian institution building, such as the Ashurbanipal Library, representation, dialogue, and co-curation, ensuring that these ancient materials speak not just to humanity's past, but to the continuing story of a living people.